On the humid night of 25th of June 1906, on the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden, New York, a young woman in a pale gown and enormous picture hat sits at a cabaret table and quietly adjusts the pins beneath its brim. Orchestra music from Mamselle's champagne spills into the warm air. Electric bulbs trace the arches that architect Stanford White himself designed. The woman is Florence Evelyn Nesbit, barely in her 20s, already famous enough that an Otto Cerrone photograph of her hangs in shop windows and chocolate box lids. A New York paper once ran a feature under the headline, "Her winsome face to be seen only from 8 to 11 p.m., a timetable of beauty turned into working hours. Tonight, as she smooths the edge of her hat, she is both spectator and spectacle. At another table, White laughs with friends. Somewhere behind her, Harry K. Thaw stares rigid at the man he believes destroyed her. When the gunshots come, the crowd at first thinks it is part of the show. Only later will newspapers name it the crime of the century and fix her face at its center. By Christmas Day, 1894, in the small industrial borough of Natrona, Pennsylvania, just northeast of Pittsburgh, the Nesbit family's fortunes had already begun their long collapse. Florence Evelyn Nesbit, born on Christmas Day in either 1884 or 1885, the records themselves uncertain, as if her story begins in ambiguity, is a girl of about 10 when her father, Winfield Scott Nesbit, an attorney, dies unexpectedly. The death, occurring when Evelyn is still a child, leaves her mother and younger brother Howard with almost no income and diminishing prospects in a town where respectability requires financial foundation. The Natrona house, modest by any standard, becomes harder to maintain. Mrs. Nesbit, whose Christian name sources variously record as Elizabeth or Helen, faces the calculations familiar to widows of limited means. What can be sold? What economies can be managed? What work might be found that will not completely erase the family's claim to middle-class standing? For a woman of her generation and class, the options are narrow. She can take in sewing, accept help from relatives, or move to a larger city where work might exist, but anonymity also offers cover for the compromises survival requires. The physical details of Evelyn's childhood in Natrona appear only fragmentarily in later sources. Biographers mention a house, a small yard, the sounds of the Allegheny River, and the steel mills that define the region's economy. What the documentary record emphasizes instead is loss. The father gone, the security vanished, the childhood abbreviated by necessity. Years later, in her 1934 memoir Prodigal Days, Evelyn would describe these years with careful understatement, noting that we were not well off and that her mother did her best, phrases that conceal as much as they reveal about the anxiety of genteel poverty. By 1898, the decision was made. The family relocated to Philadelphia, a city large enough to offer work and anonymity in equal measure. They settle in cramped rooms, the addresses changing frequently as finances dictate. Mrs. Nesbit finds employment, and both children work when they can. The descent from a lawyer's family to the working poor happens quietly, marked not by dramatic events, but by the slow erosion of options, the gradual narrowing of futures once imagined. In Philadelphia, all three Nesbits find work at Wanamaker's department store, the massive retail palace founded by John Wanamaker on Market Street. The store, completed in its grand form in 1876, represented modern commercial culture at its most ambitious. 7 floors of goods, pneumatic tubes for transactions, electric lights, and an organ that played concerts for shoppers. To work there was to stand at the intersection of old and new economies. The personal service of traditional shops combined with the scale and spectacle of industrial capitalism. Store records from the period, fragmentary but suggestive, indicate that young Evelyn worked behind a counter, likely in the glove department or another section deemed suitable for a girl of respectable background. The work was exhausting, long hours standing, the constant requirement to smile and defer, the low pay that barely contributed to household survival. Yet the position also placed her in public view, an accident of geography that would determine everything that followed. Contemporary accounts, compiled from later interviews and memoirs, recall that a customer noticed the girl with great brown eyes and an unusual face, not conventionally pretty in the bland manner of Gibson girl illustrations, but striking, memorable, photogenic. The customer, possibly an artist's wife, or a woman connected to Philadelphia's arts community, suggested that Evelyn might pose for artists instead of selling gloves. The suggestion, casual to the customer, was momentous to Mrs. Nesbit, who understood immediately that modeling paid better than retail and offered a veneer of artistic respectability that softened its proximity to more disreputable forms of display. Soon, studio appointment books in Philadelphia list Miss Nesbit as a regular model for illustrators and stained glass designers. The work, documented in payment records and later artist memoirs, involved hours of stillness, holding poses while painters sketched and refined. She learns to hold still until her muscles ache, to tilt her chin just so at the artist's direction, and, almost unconsciously, to touch the brim of her hat when the painter pauses, checking the angle that flatters her best. The gesture, barely conscious at first, becomes a habit, a moment of self-assessment and adjustment between the passive endurance of being looked at. Philadelphia's artistic community, while less prominent than New York's or Boston's, maintained networks connecting commercial illustration, fine art, and the new field of artistic photography. Evelyn's face begins appearing in book illustrations, on calendars, in advertisements, her image proliferating through the reproductive technologies that were transforming visual culture. She is paid by the hour or by the day. The rate's modest but significantly better than department store wages. The family's financial situation stabilizes slightly, though security remains distant. Archival photographs from this period, preserved in various collections, show a teenager already learning that her face can pay the rent. The images reveal someone learning the vocabulary of pose and presentation, the tilt of the head that elongates the neck, the arrangement of hands that suggests grace rather than labor, the slight smile that conveys invitation without impropriety. These are professional skills, acquired through repetition and observation, the working knowledge of someone whose body has become her primary asset in an economy increasingly built on images. The girl who once sold gloves in a department store will become a face that sells everything from chocolate to scandal. But in 1898, in Philadelphia studios smelling of linseed oil and turpentine, she is simply a teenager learning to hold still, to let others decide how she looks, and to touch the brim of her hat in the moments when the gaze briefly lifts and she can, for an instant, reassess herself. In November 1900, Mrs. Nesbit made the decision that would transform her daughter's life from regional model to national phenomenon. She writes from their cramped back room on West 22nd Street, Manhattan, to artists she met in Philadelphia, enclosing letters of introduction from painter James Carroll Beckwith. Beckwith, a respected academic painter whose patron connections included the Astor family, provides entree to New York's established artistic circles, the network of portraitists, illustrators, and photographers who supplied images for the city's publishing industry. The move to New York represents both ambition and calculation. By 1900, the city had become the undisputed center of American commercial culture. The publishing houses that produce mass circulation magazines are concentrated in Manhattan. The photographic studios that create celebrity images cluster in specific districts. The theaters that launch national tours radiate from Broadway. For someone whose only marketable asset is appearance, New York offers possibilities unavailable elsewhere, though the competition is also far more intense. The 22nd Street address places them in Chelsea, a neighborhood transitioning between residential respectability and commercial encroachment. The rooms, described in Evelyn's memoirs as small and poorly lit, house mother, daughter, and brother in close quarters. The proximity means no privacy, every decision made collectively, or at least observed by all. Mrs. Nesbit manages the household economy, negotiates with landladies, and increasingly positions herself as her daughter's manager, deciding which modeling opportunities to accept and which to decline. Studio ledgers and the Library of Congress print collections show Evelyn appearing in works by Beckwith, Frederick S. Church, and others during this period. The progression is documented. From anonymous figure in illustration backgrounds to featured subject, from generic pretty girl to recognized face. By 1901, photographer Otto Ceroni's portraits of Evelyn Nesbit circulate widely, reproduced on postcards and sold in shops, her image becoming a commodity that generates revenue she will never fully control. Cerony, German-born and trained, had established himself as one of America's premier celebrity photographers. His studio on Union Square photographed actors, politicians, writers, and society figures, creating the visual grammar of fame in the age before cinema. His technique, dramatic lighting, careful staging, retouching that enhanced without obvious artifice, produced images that seemed to capture essential personality while actually constructing it through technical manipulation. A 1901 Cerony photograph, heightened contrast, elaborate hat with feathers and ribbons, a faintly enigmatic smile, would later be captioned simply, Evelyn Nesbit, photo by Otto Cerony. The image, now held by the Library of Congress and frequently reproduced, shows a young woman already aware of the camera, already performing a version of herself refined through repetition. The enormous hat, fashionable in the period's exaggerated millinery styles, frames her face while also dominating it, the brim casting shadows that the photographer uses to sculpt features through light and darkness. Day after day, she sits beneath hot skylights in various studios, the rustle of taffeta and the smell of oil paint filling the air as artist work. The sensory experience of modeling, the heat from the lights, the stiffness of elaborate costumes, the ache of holding poses, the peculiar combination of being intensely observed while also being invisible as a person, shapes her understanding of her own relationship to her image. She is there but not there, essential but replaceable, valued but only for the surface that cameras and brushes can capture. Between poses she straightens, flexes her cramped fingers, and adjusts the pins in her oversized hat, a tiny act of self-possession in rooms where everyone else decides how she will look. The gesture recurs across accounts, the moment between directions, when she briefly reclaims agency over her own presentation, checking in the mirror or by touch that the hat sits correctly, that the angle flatters, that the persona she is constructing remains intact. The work is professional and exhausting. She learns the technical vocabulary of the studios, tilt left, hold that, softer in the eyes, and the physical discipline of the model, ignoring discomfort, maintaining expression despite fatigue, inhabiting whatever role the artist imagines without questioning or commenting. The training is valuable but also damaging, teaching her to suppress her own discomfort in service of others' visions, to understand her worth as purely visual, to measure success by how effectively she can become what others want to see. The more her image travels, reproduced in magazines, sold as postcards, copied by other artists, the less control she has over where it appears. Copyright in this period protects photographers and publishers, not models. Once Cerony sells a print, he has no obligation to track its subsequent uses. Evelyn's face appears on advertisements for products she has never used, in contexts she has never approved, accompanying text she has never seen. The proliferation is both validation and violation, proof of her marketability and evidence of her powerlessness. By late 1901, newspaper articles began mentioning Miss Evelyn Nesbit by name, identifying her as a popular artist's model. The publicity is professionally valuable but personally complicated. Recognition brings more work, but also more scrutiny. Strangers stare at her on the street, comparing the living person to the idealized image. Men approach her, assuming that public visibility implies availability. The boundary between professional model and public property begins eroding, a process that will accelerate as her fame increases. By the time she is 16, strangers recognize her on the street from pictures she has never actually seen. The disconnect between image and person becomes a defining condition of her life. She exists simultaneously as herself, a teenager helping support her family, living in cramped rooms, working long hours, and as Evelyn Nesbit, a figure constructed through photography and illustration, existing in thousands of copies across the country, meaning different things to different viewers, but never quite belonging to the person whose face supplied the raw material. By July 1901, Evelyn's career shifted from static modeling to theatrical performance, a transition that amplified both her visibility and her vulnerability. At the Casino Theater on Broadway, she stands in a line of 6 young women in pink walking dresses and enormous black picture hats, the famed Florodora girls. The chorus line from the musical Florodora that has become a cultural phenomenon. Playbills list her as Florence Evelyn. Gossip columns soon simply say Evelyn Nesbit, the recognition now sufficient that last names are unnecessary. The Florodora girls represented a specific phenomenon in turn-of-the-century theatrical culture. Unlike anonymous chorus members, these 6 women were featured performers, their names publicized, their photographs sold, their offstage lives chronicled in the press. The show's signature number, Tell Me Pretty Maiden, required the 6 women to parade with parasols while male dancers pursued them, a stylized courtship that audiences found enchanting and that newspapers invested with significance beyond mere entertainment. The casting followed strict requirements. All 6 women had to be approximately the same height, possess similar hourglass figures, and embody the idealized American beauty type that dominated period aesthetics. They wore identical costumes, the pink dresses and black hats that became iconic, creating a visual effect of symmetrical perfection. Individual women subordinated to collective image. The uniformity was the point. These were interchangeable units of beauty, professionally presented for consumption. Newspapers make much of the chorus' supposed power to marry well. Several members did, in fact, wed millionaires. And Mrs. Nesbit, like other anxious stage mothers who haunted the theater district, hears and believes the stories. The narrative was simultaneously true and misleading. Some Florodora girls did marry wealthy men they met through the theater, but the number was small and the outcomes often unhappy. The publicity surrounding these marriages, however, created an impression that chorus work was a legitimate path to social mobility for beautiful young women of limited means, a fantasy that masked the reality of precarious employment, sexual harassment, and exploitation. A New York Herald piece on 4th May 1902 runs 2 pages of photographs under the headline, Her Winsome Face to be Seen Only from 8 to 11 p.m., turning Evelyn's working hours into part of the fantasy. The article, preserved in newspaper archives, exemplifies how theatrical publicity transformed working women into commodities. The text describes her beauty in detail, notes her youth and respectability, and invites readers to see her perform, the language hovering between aesthetic appreciation and sexual invitation without quite crossing into explicit impropriety. The economics of chorus work, rarely discussed in publicity but evident in surviving records, involve low pay supplemented by the expectation of male patronage. Actresses were paid wages insufficient for survival and were implicitly expected to accept gifts, dinners, and arrangements with wealthy admirers. The system, never officially acknowledged, meant that financial stability required navigating relationships with men who viewed theatrical performers as available for purchase, their public display implying private accessibility. Backstage, chorus girls adjust their hats before the mirror, tightening ribbons with gloved fingers as the orchestra tunes. The preparation ritual, observed by journalists granted backstage access for feature stories, fascinated contemporary observers who described it as evidence of feminine vanity while ignoring the labor involved. The hats, enormous and heavy, required careful pinning to remain secure during performances. The adjustment was not decoration but necessity, the difference between professional presentation and embarrassing mishap. For Evelyn, the hat ritual is now less about shyness than readiness. Each tilt is a calculation of visibility. Each adjustment a checking of the armor that makes public performance possible. The gesture has evolved from the unconscious habit of the Philadelphia studios to a conscious preparation, a moment of self-assessment before stepping into the lights and the gaze of hundreds. The hat, massive and ornate, becomes both costume and shield, something to hide behind while also something that makes her more visible, more spectacular, more available for the consumption that pays her wages. The theater promises independence, regular wages, professional identity, escape from the cramped rooms on 22nd Street, but it also turns her body into a commodity, traded between audience, agents, and suitors who see her performance as an invitation to negotiate for private access. Stage door admirers wait after performances, sending cards and gifts backstage, requesting introductions through theater management. Some are harmless, fans genuinely appreciative of artistic performance. Others are predatory, wealthy men who understand theatrical employment as a market where youth and beauty can be purchased if the price is right. Mrs. Nesbit, positioned as chaperone and manager, must navigate these approaches, accepting gifts that supplement inadequate wages while attempting to preserve her daughter's reputation and future prospects. The negotiations are delicate. Too much refusal risks insulting powerful men who control theatrical employment. Too much acceptance risks reputation and the possibility of respectable marriage. The balance is impossible, the situation structured to ensure that whatever choice is made can be reinterpreted as evidence of impropriety. Reviews of Florodora performances, preserved in theater collections and newspaper archives, mention Evelyn specifically, praising her beauty and stage presence while noting her youth. The attention is professionally valuable, marking her as a standout even within a famous ensemble. But the attention also singles her out for particular scrutiny, making her the target of both admiration and moral judgment, the focus of speculation about her offstage life and relationships. On Broadway, she is paid to be looked at, a skill that will later be dissected in a courtroom, frame by frame. The training in visibility, in being observed, in managing her appearance for public consumption, prepares her for the theatrical spectacle of testimony but cannot prepare her for the violence of having her private life examined as evidence, her body and choices subjected to forensic analysis, her performance skills reinterpreted as evidence of deception rather than professional competence. In late 1901, on West 24th Street in Manhattan, chorus girl Edna Goodrich brought Evelyn to lunch at the multi-level apartment of architect Stanford White, the celebrated partner of McKim, Mead, and White, the firm that had designed some of America's most prominent buildings. The entrance, discreetly tucked beside the back door of F.O. Schwartz's toy store, leads up narrow stairs to rooms that contemporary accounts describe as overflowing with tapestries, art, exotic furnishings, and the accumulated treasures of a man with unlimited budget and Catholic tastes. Stanford White, at 57, was at the height of his professional power and cultural influence. His firm had designed the Washington Square Arch, the original Madison Square Garden, whose rooftop would later stage his death, the Boston Public Library, and countless mansions for New York's elite. He was married to Bessie Springs Smith, lived in a respectable home on Long Island, and maintained this separate Manhattan apartment for entertaining clients and pursuing interests his domestic life could not accommodate. The apartment functioned as a private museum, masculine retreat, and seduction space. White collected art, antiques, and architectural fragments with the passion of someone for whom acquisition substituted for preservation. He also collected young women, particularly performers and models whose beauty he claimed to appreciate aesthetically while pursuing sexually. The pattern was sufficiently well known in theatrical circles that mothers both warned daughters about him and sought his patronage, understanding that his interest, however dangerous, could advance careers. Evelyn will recall, in her 1934 memoir Prodigal Days, feeling overwhelmed by the decadence, the heavy drapes blocking daylight, the soft carpets that muffled footsteps, the way her own hat and simple dress seemed almost childish against the opulent decor. The sensory details matter, the smell of incense and old fabric, the temperature kept warm by radiators, the peculiar silence created by thick walls and carpets that absorbed sound. The apartment was designed for privacy, for encounters that would leave no witnesses, for experiences that could later be denied. After luncheon, elaborate food served by a discreet servant who appeared and disappeared without speaking, they climbed to the famous red velvet swing in a room described by some accounts as green-walled, by others as hung with mirrors. The swing, suspended from the ceiling by red velvet ropes, has become the most notorious detail of White's apartment. The object that, in trial testimony and popular imagination, came to symbolize his corruption of young women. The swing served multiple purposes. It was a conversation piece, theatrical prop, and instrument of sexualization. Young women were encouraged to swing while White and his guests watched, the activity transforming them into moving spectacle while also placing them in deliberately childish roles. The combination, adult bodies in childish activity, evening dress in playground equipment, sexual sophistication masked by innocent play, exemplified White's particular form of predation, which involved infantilizing young women while treating them as available for adult sexual exchange. Contemporary accounts describe Evelyn swinging that first day, White and Edna Goodrich watching and applauding. The detail, recorded in multiple sources, captures the dynamic. Evelyn performing at the direction of older, more powerful people, her body on display, her compliance secured through social pressure, and the presence of another woman who normalizes the situation. Edna's role, intentionally or not, was to make the encounter seem safe, to suggest that this was ordinary social interaction rather than the beginning of calculated seduction. Here, etiquette is no longer about tea tables and calling cards. It is about what can and cannot be refused when power imbalances structure every interaction. Evelyn, at 16 or 17, already supporting her family through modeling and theater work, cannot risk offending White, whose connections control access to theatrical employment and artistic commissions. The word of a respected architect, should he choose to speak against her, could end her career before it properly begins. She watches White joke with guests, noticing how servants respond to him, how easily he orders champagne, how he praises her, looks as though they were part of the decor. The observations, recorded in her later memoirs, show someone learning to read power, watching who defers to whom, understanding that charm and courtesy can coexist with exploitation, recognizing that the elaborate social performance masks relations of domination, that beautiful manners do not eliminate but only disguise. Her training in poise, the still patience of the artist's model, the disciplined performance of the chorus line, has not prepared her for this lesson. That refinement can also conceal predation, that the same codes of politeness that govern respectable society also provide cover for abuse, that grace and violation can occupy the same spaces, separated only by who holds power and who must defer. The afternoon ends with White giving Evelyn his card, expressing hope that she will visit again, offering vague promises about helping her career. The language is careful, maintaining plausible deniability while establishing the terms of future exchange. She understands, though perhaps not yet fully, that his interest in her beauty is not aesthetic appreciation but sexual pursuit, that the help he offers comes with expectations, that the apartment exists precisely to facilitate encounters that respectable society officially condemns while unofficially tolerating as the privilege of wealthy men. In the weeks that follow, the invitations continue. White sends tickets to shows, arranges small parties where Evelyn meets other young performers, establishes himself as patron and protector. Mrs. Nesbit, aware of his reputation but desperate for any advantage that might secure her daughter's future, allows the relationship to develop. The moral calculation is impossible. Refusing risks poverty, accepting risks reputation and potentially worse. In a system structured to exploit young women's economic vulnerability, there are no good choices, only choices with different categories of harm. The man who commissions Beaux-Arts facades for millionaires has begun redesigning the life of a teenage chorus girl, applying the same confidence in his own judgment, the same assumption that beautiful things exist to be acquired and displayed, the same conviction that his wealth and taste entitle him to possess whatever attracts his attention. The hat Evelyn adjusts before entering his apartment each time becomes a kind of costume piece, part of the performance of consent to an arrangement that has never been negotiated between equals. On a winter evening in early 1902, in a suite at the Wellington Hotel on 7th Avenue, Evelyn's mother packs for a trip back to Pittsburgh to settle some family business. Mrs. Nesbit, assured by Stanford White that he will watch over her daughter during her absence, accepts his offer to continue paying for their hotel rooms and for Howard's tuition at Chester Military Academy in Pennsylvania, a school that White has also arranged and funded. The financial arrangements, never formally documented but confirmed through multiple sources, exemplify how White secured compliance by making himself indispensable to the family's survival, by creating dependency that makes refusal nearly impossible. The pattern was not unique to Evelyn. White maintained similar arrangements with other young performers and their families, positioning himself as benefactor while engineering situations that facilitated sexual access. The system worked because it provided genuine material benefits: the rent paid, the school tuition covered, the small gifts that eased poverty's pressures, while also creating obligations that could be called due at any moment. With her mother away, Evelyn finds herself more frequently at White's apartment. Later, in White's 24th Street apartment, she dines with him alone one evening, the first time without other guests or the presence of another woman. In her memoir and sworn testimony at Harry Thaw's trial in 1907, she describes champagne served by the silent servant, a tour of the rooms where White points out particular treasures, and finally the so-called mirror room, furnished with a green velvet sofa and mirrored walls that multiplied images of whoever entered. The mirror room, described in trial testimony and analyzed in countless subsequent accounts, functioned as both boudoir and theater. The mirrors allowed White to watch from multiple angles, transforming private sexual encounters into spectacle for his own gaze. The room's design revealed his aesthetic: sex as visual performance, women as objects to be viewed from all perspectives, pleasure derived as much from looking as from touching. Evelyn remembers changing into a yellow satin kimono at his suggestion, the foreign garment another of White's exotic props. She remembers champagne making her dizzy, the room beginning to tilt. She remembers waking up naked beside him, blood on the sheets. The moment she understands is the loss of her virginity through assault, though the terminology available to her in 1902 offers no language that clearly names rape when the perpetrator is respectable and wealthy, when the victim is working class and theatrical, when alcohol and deliberate planning allow denial of force. This account enters the historical record through multiple sources: her affidavit, Evelyn's Story, written in 1903, trial transcripts from 1907, and her memoirs from 1914 and 1934. The consistency across sources lends credibility, though contemporary and later commentators would debate endlessly whether it was rape or seduction, whether she was victim or participant, whether her subsequent acceptance of gifts and continued contact meant retroactive consent. The debate, still ongoing in some accounts, exemplifies how society has always struggled to acknowledge that power imbalances can negate consent, that continuing a relationship after assault does not prove assault did not occur, that economic dependency can compel behaviors that appear voluntary but are actually coerced. Courts, newspapers, and moralists will argue over whether it was rape or seduction. What remains constant is the imbalance of age. He was 47. She was 16 or 17. Status: he was celebrated architect. She was chorus girl. And space: his apartment, his servants, his territory where he controlled every element. The physical evidence of virginity lost, blood on sheets, appears in multiple accounts. The champagne deliberately used to incapacitate appears in her testimony. The mirror room designed for his viewing pleasure, not her comfort, appears in descriptions of the apartment. Yet the legal and moral framework of 1902 offered limited recognition of rape when no weapon was used, when the victim knew the perpetrator, when circumstances suggested seduction rather than violent assault. The age of consent in New York was 18, technically making White's action statutory rape, but enforcement of such laws focused primarily on protecting elite daughters from working-class men, not chorus girls from wealthy architects. The hat she once adjusted to look older now lies on a chair in a room where she has no say in what happens next. The prop that helped her perform maturity, that made her look sophisticated enough to model and perform now marks the limit of her control. She can adjust how others see her from the outside, can manage surface presentation, but cannot protect herself from men who understand that presentation as an invitation, who mistake or deliberately misconstrue performance for availability. In the days that follow, White acts as though nothing unusual occurred. He continues to offer assistance, pay bills, and provide gifts. Evelyn, confused and traumatized, but also aware that her family depends on his support, continues to accept help. While trying to process what has happened, the relationship, if it can be called that, continues for months, White treating her as a kind of kept woman without formal arrangement, Evelyn navigating between revulsion and dependence, between wanting escape and needing his financial support. The psychological complexity, difficult to capture in trial testimony or newspaper accounts, involves someone learning to dissociate, to separate body from self, to continue performing normalcy while privately attempting to survive trauma. The skills learned as a model, remaining still, suppressing discomfort, letting others direct her presentation, now serve in surviving sexual exploitation. The same training that prepared her for professional visibility, making her vulnerable to private abuse. In the archive, the mirror room survives only in words, multiple accounts describing its layout, function, and decor. A space built to flatter one man's gaze, now preserved as evidence of what it cost her. The physical room no longer exists. White's apartment was long ago dismantled and its contents dispersed, but the mirror room persists in cultural memory as a symbol of Gilded Age excess, of the exploitation of young women, of the architecture of abuse that beautiful facades concealed, of how spaces themselves can be designed to facilitate violation while maintaining plausible deniability about what occurred within them. By October 1902, Evelyn had vanished from Broadway columns, her absence from the stage unexplained in public notices. According to the chronology compiled for the trials of Harry Thaw and preserved in legal histories, Stanford White arranges, with Mrs. Nesbit's consent, for Evelyn's enrollment at a girls' boarding school in New Jersey, administered by Matilda DeMille, mother of future film director Cecil B. DeMille. The school, located in Pompton Lakes, offered genteel education for young women whose circumstances required both instruction and discretion. The timing suggests multiple motivations. White, aware that Evelyn's theatrical visibility makes their relationship increasingly difficult to conceal, sees boarding school as a convenient solution. She disappears from public view, reducing risk to his reputation while remaining under his financial control and emotional influence. Mrs. Nesbit, possibly aware that her daughter has become sexually involved with White, hopes boarding school might salvage respectability, provide education that would make Evelyn marriageable to someone other than her current protector, and offer escape from a situation that has already gone further than intended. School records and later narratives describe a regime of early rising, chapel, classes, supervised walks, an attempt to impose middle-class discipline on a girl whose image is already famous, whose experience already far exceeds what boarding school curriculum can address. The other students, drawn from prosperous middle-class families, likely had little in common with someone who had supported her family since childhood, worked in theater, and been sexually involved with a man older than their fathers. The isolation must have been profound, the gap between official curriculum and actual experience creating a kind of double consciousness where Evelyn performs as a student while privately inhabiting knowledge that makes the performance absurd. Letters between Mrs. Nesbit and the school, though not all preserved, are mentioned in biographical accounts as expressing concerns about influences and the need to keep Evelyn away from the theater for a time. The language, coded to maintain propriety, suggests all parties understood that removal was protective or corrective, that something needed managing or containing, that the theater world had damaged or endangered her in ways that required intervention. In this setting, the hat ritual becomes one of conformity, straightening a sober brim before chapel, smoothing a plain ribbon instead of a panorama of feathers. The transformation from elaborate theatrical millinery to school-appropriate plainness mirrors the attempted transformation of Evelyn herself from public performer to private student, from spectacular to ordinary, from sexualized to innocent, but the attempted reversal cannot work. Experience cannot be unlearned, visibility cannot be erased, and the images already circulating ensure she can never be truly anonymous. The curriculum, languages, literature, deportment, music, offers skills meant to prepare students for respectable marriage and domestic management. For Evelyn, already fluent in the skills boarding school teaches, the instruction must seem beside the point. She already knows how to present herself, manage social situations, and perform femininity. What she needs: financial security, protection from exploitation, recognition of trauma, the school cannot provide because acknowledging need would require acknowledging what happened, which would destroy the fiction that boarding school exists to prevent rather than address damage. Yet the discipline does not erase the past, it merely pauses it, creating an interlude where the narrative briefly stops while all participants pretend transformation is possible. The pause cannot hold. The forces that produced her situation, poverty, theatrical exploitation, wealthy men's sense of entitlement, remain active, waiting to reassert themselves when the artificial protective space of school ends. When she falls ill with appendicitis in April 1903, it is not White but Harry K. Thaw, already obsessed with her, who sends a private doctor and pays for an emergency operation. The intervention, documented in multiple accounts, represents Thaw's first significant material gesture toward Evelyn. His entry into the network of men who vie for access by providing financial assistance. The operation, performed at a hospital and requiring recovery time, effectively ends her time at boarding school. The health crisis becomes the mechanism through which one form of constraint ends and another begins. Thaw, heir to a Pittsburgh railroad fortune, had seen Evelyn perform in Florodora, become fascinated or obsessed, made inquiries about her circumstances, and learned of her relationship with White. His interest combines genuine attraction with a moral crusade mentality. He sees White as corrupter of innocence and himself as potential rescuer, the narrative appealing to his sense of righteous purpose while also providing justification for his pursuit of a woman young enough to be his daughter. The medical crisis creates opportunity. With Evelyn vulnerable, her mother anxious, and White's absence leaving space for another patron, Thaw positions himself as a concerned benefactor. He sends flowers, pays medical bills, offers assistance to Mrs. Nesbit, establishing himself as a reliable presence exactly when reliability matters most. The pattern mimics White's earlier approach, establishing dependency through generosity. But Thaw adds elements of moral judgment and protective rhetoric that White, more cynical or honest, had omitted. At a school meant to protect her from scandal, the next chapter of scandal quietly buys its way in through the infirmary door. The institution that was supposed to pause her trajectory, allow reinvention, create space for middle-class respectability to take root, instead becomes merely an interlude between one form of exploitation and another. The failure is structural, not personal. No boarding school could address what Evelyn actually needed because her needs arose from economic and power structures that individual institutions could not counter. The hat carefully chosen for school plainness will soon give way to more elaborate styles as Evelyn re-enters public life, but the months in New Jersey represent something significant despite their failure, a moment when alternatives were briefly imagined, when transformation seemed possible, when the path that led from poverty through theatrical fame toward tragedy might have been redirected. That the redirection failed does not eliminate the importance of the attempt, only underscores how difficult escape becomes once certain forces have been set in motion. In May 1903, passenger manifests for transatlantic steamers record Evelyn, her mother, and Harry Thaw boarding for Europe, a recuperative trip financed by Thaw after Evelyn's appendicitis operation. The journey, ostensibly for Evelyn's health and culture, actually serves Thaw's purpose of removing her from White's sphere of influence and establishing his own claim. They tour London, Paris, and the spas and castles of Central Europe, a grand tour that in other circumstances might represent privilege and pleasure, but that contemporary and later accounts reveal as deeply disturbing. The European journey, documented through hotel registers, social notices in European papers, and later testimony, follows a pattern. Public display of Thaw as generous patron and Evelyn as grateful protege. Private eruptions of violence and control that witnesses do not see, but that Evelyn will later describe in her affidavit and testimony. The contradiction between public performance and private reality exemplifies Gilded Age dynamics, where respectability and abuse coexisted, where class status protected men's violence from scrutiny, where women's economic dependence compelled continued performance even as private suffering intensified. In London, they stay at fashionable hotels, attend theater, shop at exclusive establishments. Thaw purchases elaborate wardrobes for Evelyn, gowns, hats, jewelry, both generous gifts and instruments of control, clothing her in his taste, replacing her own choices with his preferences, marking her as his creation. The gifts, like White's earlier financial support, create obligation while also providing genuine material benefit, making straightforward judgment of their meaning difficult. The dress is beautiful and wanted. The dress is also uniform and constraint. Photographs from the European journey, a few preserved in archives, show Evelyn in elaborate hats and fashionable dress, Thaw beside her, looking proud or possessive, depending on interpretation. The images, like so many photographs of this era, capture surface while concealing depths, showing what can be safely displayed while omitting what must remain private. Evelyn has learned to pose, to present the face required, to perform contentment or gratitude or romance, while privately experiencing something quite different. Later, biographies in Evelyn's 1914 memoir describe a disturbing pattern that develops as they travel deeper into Europe. Gifts of clothes and jewelry alternating with accusations and interrogations about White, public displays of gallantry, followed by private eruptions of anger, apologies and promises mixed with threats and violence. Thaw, obsessed with White's earlier relationship with Evelyn, demands details, forces her to recount the assault and subsequent involvement, interprets her compliance with White as evidence of her corruption rather than his victimization of her. The obsession reveals Thaw's psychology. He fixates on Evelyn as White's victim, requiring rescue, but also as White's possession that Thaw seeks to claim, competing with White through her body. The dynamic traps Evelyn in an impossible position. Admitting the assault and relationship confirms her value as a victim to be avenged, but also marks her as damaged goods whose value Thaw simultaneously insists on restoring and uses to justify his own control. In one notorious episode at a remote Austrian castle, identified in some sources as Schloss Katzenstein, though the exact location remains disputed, Thaw locks Evelyn in a room, beats her with a whip or riding crop. Accounts vary, and alternates between apologies and manic religiosity, ranting about sin, purity, and his mission to protect innocent girls from corruptors like White. The assault, described in Evelyn's affidavit and echoed in psychiatric assessments of Thaw's mental instability, exemplifies how his protective rhetoric masks sadistic impulses, how his claimed moral purpose justified violence, how rescue and domination intertwined in his treatment of her. The episode is documented through Evelyn's own accounts, corroborated by physical evidence of injuries mentioned in medical records, and consistent with patterns of behavior that multiple witnesses would later testify to. The castle's remoteness ensured privacy. The travel context meant no reliable protection or escape route existed. Thaw's wealth and social status meant local authorities would be unlikely to intervene, even if Evelyn sought help. The vulnerability, absolute in that moment, exemplifies how power imbalances structure abuse, how isolation enables violence, how wealth purchases immunity from consequences. On promenades in Paris or London after such episodes, Evelyn appears as the perfect American beauty abroad, tilting her hat just so for continental photographers, smiling in the manner that has made her famous, performing the role required while privately calculating survival strategies. The performance, now habitual, requires immense psychological effort, separating body from self, suppressing fear, maintaining composure, calculating when resistance might be safely attempted, and when submission is the only viable response to violence or threat. The hats worn during the European journey, elaborate and expensive pieces purchased by Thaw, become both ornament and armor, something beautiful that provides a focus for attention, while also something to hide behind when his temper flares, a brim that casts shadow over expressions that might reveal too much, a prop that helps maintain the performance that wearing it requires. The gesture of adjusting the hat, now performed scores of times across hotel lobbies and city streets, becomes a kind of reset button, a moment to reconstruct composure, check that the mask remains intact, prepare for the next scene in a performance that has no intermission and no final curtain that would allow her to step out of role. Thaw's version of protection mirrors broader Gilded Age anxieties, moral crusades used to mask personal obsession, chivalry invoked to justify control, religious language deployed to sanctify violence. His rhetoric about saving innocent girls from predatory men like White conceals, barely, his own predation, his own assumption that Evelyn exists to serve his psychological and sexual needs, his own violent assertion of ownership that differs from White's exploitation primarily in its more overt brutality. The man who will one day declare he killed for her honor is already rehearsing what it means to own her body, already demonstrating that his protection is another form of possession, already establishing that his love is indistinguishable from his violence. The European journey, ostensibly recuperative and cultural, actually serves as a preview of the marriage that will follow. Beautiful surfaces concealing cruelty, public display masking private suffering, her image as a smiling companion coexisting with the welts and bruises that photographs never capture. Back in New York, by autumn 1904, theater columns again mention Evelyn, now starring in George Lederer's The Wild Rose, as Vashti, a featured role rather than a chorus position. The promotion represents professional advancement, named in advertising, featured in publicity materials, earning higher wages, no longer interchangeable with other performers but individually marketable. A 2-page New York Herald spread, illustrated with studio photographs, recounts her journey from model to key cast member, lingering on her winsome face and bewitching eyes, the language combining theatrical criticism with the quasi-erotic description that characterized coverage of actresses in this period. The return to New York and theater represents both professional opportunity and renewed public visibility that makes private arrangements increasingly difficult to maintain. Evelyn, now more famous than before her European trip, draws attention that makes discreet relationships with wealthy patrons harder to conceal. Gossip column items link her name to various men speculating about romance and potential engagements, the publicity serving theatrical publicity while also making her romantic life a subject of public fascination and moral judgment. Illustrations by Charles Dana Gibson and others, though not always explicitly identified as based on Evelyn, echo her features. A 1905 cartoon titled Woman, the Eternal Question clearly resembles her, confirming that her image is now woven into the national ideal of feminine beauty. The Gibson girl aesthetic, tall, athletic, confident, with elaborate piled hair and enormous hats, dominated early 20th century visual culture. Gibson's illustrations appeared in mass circulation magazines, were reprinted on postcards and advertisements, and established the standard against which real women measured themselves and were measured by others. Evelyn's face and figure, fitting the Gibson girl type, made her both an example and exploitation of the ideal. She embodied what the drawings depicted, providing the real-world referent for the illustrated fantasy. But the relationship between illustration and reality was complex. Artists selected and emphasized features that fit their preconceptions, while women modified their appearance to match the drawings, creating a feedback loop where image and reality continuously reshaped each other. At the same time, gossip notes link her to John Barrymore, the young actor from the theatrical dynasty, Monty Waterbury, a wealthy heir, and publisher Robert J. Collier, among others. The press attention, relentless and speculative, treats her romantic life as public entertainment, printing rumors with minimal verification, creating narratives of romance or scandal with little regard for truth or consequences, while White continues to pay bills and maintain contact from a position of past intimacy. And Thaw watches from the audience, attending dozens of performances. His obsession is unabated by the European journey's conclusion. The triangulation of male attention, White's continuing financial involvement, Thaw's obsessive pursuit, and various other suitors' more casual interest places Evelyn at the center of competing claims. Each man projects his own narrative onto her. White sees her as a cherished acquisition, Thaw as a victim requiring rescue and revenge, the others as available beauty, whose theatrical employment suggests accessibility. None of these narratives originates with Evelyn. All are imposed on her, competing for dominance, turning her into a symbol and prize in contests that are fundamentally about male ego, status, and power, rather than about her as a person. Evelyn has become a symbol others fight over. Architect, millionaire, actors, and publishers all projecting their narratives onto a woman whose livelihood depends on being seen. The visibility that enables her professional success also makes her vulnerable to constant scrutiny, speculation, and appropriation. She exists simultaneously as professional performer, public image, and private person. But the boundaries between these roles have dissolved, leaving her perpetually on display, perpetually subject to others' interpretations, perpetually unable to control her own meaning. The economics continue to constrain options. Theater pays better than modeling, but still insufficiently for security. Mrs. Nesbit and Howard depend on Evelyn's income supplemented by White's continuing gifts and Thaw's increasingly insistent financial support. The dependency makes extraction difficult. Walking away from either man means financial hardship, yet continuing both relationships means managing incompatible demands, navigating between White's expectation of continued intimacy and Thaw's demand that she cut White off completely. The hat she adjusts before stepping on stage is now part of a brand, a recognizable element of her public persona that fans expect and that publicity photographs emphasize. The gesture, documented in photographs and witness accounts, has become signature. Evelyn checking her hat before performances, adjusting it between scenes, using it as prop in posed photographs. What began as unconscious habit has become deliberate performance, the spontaneous transformed into calculated, the personal absorbed into professional presentation. Yet the gesture retains something private, a moment when the performance briefly pauses, when she assesses rather than displays, when she touches her own image before surrendering it again to others' gazes. The adjustment, lasting seconds, represents a tiny assertion of control. In a life increasingly determined by others' demands, a brief claim to agency before resuming the roles that employment and survival require. Backstage after performances, stage door admirers compete for her attention, sending cards and elaborate floral arrangements. The gifts, some generous, some grandiose, pile up in her dressing room. Visual evidence of the commodity she has become. Each gift carries implicit or explicit expectations. Dinner, private meeting, continued relationship, sexual access. Some can be safely accepted as innocent tribute. Others carry obligations that must be carefully negotiated. The calculation required to manage these interactions while maintaining reputation and safety is exhausting. Another form of unpaid labor that theatrical employment demands beyond the performance itself. Newspaper items from this period show increasing interest in who Evelyn might marry. The speculation treating her romantic future as public concern and entertainment. The coverage assumes that marriage is her goal and that her theatrical career is merely a strategy to secure a husband, ignoring that she might value professional success for its own sake, or that marriage to any of her current admirers would require accepting men whose treatment of her has been exploitative or violent or both. Long before any gunshot, the question is not whose wife she will be, but whose story she will be forced to inhabit. The competing narratives, White's protege, Thaw's rescue mission, Gibson's idealized beauty, Broadway's rising star, all coexist, all incomplete, all imposing meanings on her that she has minimal power to contest or revise. The violence that will eventually erupt has been building in these competing claims, these incompatible narratives, these men's inability to see her as anything beyond the roles they have assigned her. On 4th April 1905 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Evelyn married Harry Kendall Thaw in a small ceremony at the home of Dr. J. W. McEwen, pastor of the Third Presbyterian Church in Shadyside, one of Pittsburgh's most prestigious neighborhoods. The wedding, private and sudden, surprises even close acquaintances. Trial testimony, recorded verbatim in the stenographic record now digitized and available through legal history archives, captures her answering in the flat, declarative tone required by legal questioning. "We were married on April 4th, 1905, in Pittsburgh." Thaw himself chooses her wedding outfit. Not a white gown, but a black traveling suit trimmed in brown. A decision that newspapers later find symbolically laden. The black suit, so contrary to wedding tradition's white-clad bride, suggests multiple interpretations. Some accounts claim Thaw chose black because Evelyn was not virginal, the color marking her as already fallen. Others suggest the black suit simply reflected practical considerations of travel and subsequent wear. Still others read it as Thaw's assertion of control, his right to determine even the most traditionally bride-centered aspect of weddings. Whatever Thaw's reasoning, the symbolism was unmistakable to contemporary observers and remains striking in photographs preserved from the occasion. The images show Evelyn in the dark suit, serious-faced, wearing a hat of moderate size and sober decoration, looking more like someone dressed for business than for celebration. The contrast with typical wedding photographs, white gown brides, elaborate veils, flowers, romantic styling, makes visible what words might conceal. This is transaction more than romance, arrangement more than love story. Headlines announce that the former chorus girl is now mistress of millions, installed at the Thaw family home, Lyndhurst, in Pittsburgh, and expected to give up the stage, modeling, and public past. The coverage emphasizes the financial transformation, from working performer to wife of wealth, from economic precarity to material security. The phrasing mistress of millions suggests power, but actually describes dependence. The millions belong to Thaw and his family, not to her, and access to wealth depends entirely on their approval and continued marriage. The Thaw family, one of Pittsburgh's industrial dynasties with fortune built on railroad and coke interests, occupies elite social standing, far above anything Evelyn has previously encountered. Mary Copley Thaw, Harry's mother, rules the family with strict Presbyterian moral authority, expecting conformity to standards of behavior that allow no accommodation for theatrical background or unconventional past. The family's acceptance of Evelyn is grudging at best, predicated on her complete reformation and subordination to family authority. Within that somber house, ruled by Mary Copley Thaw, the hat ritual turns defensive. Evelyn must choose pieces acceptable to strict Presbyterian tastes, hiding the flamboyant millinery of Broadway under sober brims and modest decorations. Letters and memoirs suggest a kind of social suffocation. She's on display during formal family gatherings and Pittsburgh social events where Thaw family attendance is required, yet rarely allowed to host independently or to travel without supervision. The visibility is entirely managed, permitted only in contexts where behavior can be controlled and presentation carefully supervised. The transformation required is total, from performer to proper wife, from independent earner to dependent spouse, from public figure to private family member, from theatrical celebrity to subordinate daughter-in-law. The training and performance that served her professionally now serves socially, allowing her to adopt whatever role circumstances demand. But the performance, now constant and without intermission, exacts a psychological cost that no earlier role required. She cannot step off stage, cannot retreat to private self, cannot acknowledge the gap between performance and reality, because the performance has become reality. Mrs. Nesbit and Howard, still dependent on financial support, now receive it through Thaw family channels, rather than Evelyn's earnings or White's gifts. The shift completes Evelyn's economic entrapment. Leaving Thaw would mean not only her own poverty but her family's as well. The guilt multiplied by knowing that her choices determine not only her own fate but theirs. The dependence, extending beyond her own person, makes escape seem impossible, the cost too high for conscience to bear. To secure material safety, she has accepted a cage whose bars are lined with piety and money. The metaphor, perhaps too obvious, nonetheless captures the reality. The Thaw mansion, luxurious and imprisoning, offers every physical comfort while denying freedom, provides economic security while eliminating autonomy, ensures survival while preventing life. The contradiction defines her situation. She has achieved the marriage that theatrical careers supposedly aim toward, the wealthy husband that Florodora girls' mothers dreamed of, the financial stability that poverty made desperate priority, and the achievement has brought not liberation but a different, more respectable form of captivity. The hat carefully chosen each morning, selected from the sober styles appropriate to Pittsburgh Presbyterian society, no longer makes her more visible, but less so, no longer draws attention but deflects it, no longer announces her presence but apologizes for it. The transformation from theatrical spectacular to respectable matron requires erasure of everything that made her notable, suppression of the visibility that was her only power, acceptance of a role that values her only for the status marriage to Thaw's heir provides to him, not for anything she is or does or wants herself. The marriage settles into a pattern that witnesses will later describe. Periods of apparent stability interrupted by Thaw's paranoid accusations about White, violent outbursts followed by apologies and gifts, restrictions on Evelyn's movement and associations justified as protection, sexual demands framed as marital rights. The violence, private and unwitnessed, escalates in frequency and intensity, but Thaw's family and social position ensure that no intervention occurs. If Evelyn complains, she is told that wives must accommodate husbands' moods. If bruises appear, they are explained away or simply ignored as domestic matters beyond outsiders' concern. The black suit Thaw selects for her wedding will look eerily like mourning in the photographs that follow the murder, the symbolism retrospectively clear. She was mourning her own freedom, her own professional identity, her own capacity for autonomous choice. The wedding, celebrated in newspapers as a social triumph, actually marks the consolidation of Thaw's control, the legal formalization of ownership he had been asserting since the European journey, the transformation of exploitation into institution with state and religious sanction, blessing the arrangement. Yet marriage also provides legal identity and social standing that theatrical fame could not. As Mrs. Harry K. Thaw, she possesses a status that Evelyn Nesbit, actress, would never achieve. The respectability she gains through marriage, though purchased at immense personal cost, offers certain protections and recognitions that professional success could not provide. The calculus remains impossible. Was the trade worth it? The question has no answer because the alternatives were not freely chosen among genuine options but forced selections among only bad possibilities. By early 1906, the Thaws were in New York again, staying at the Hotel Lorraine on Fifth Avenue, the fashionable district where new steel-framed towers house the city's wealthy elite in apartments that combine European elegance with American technological sophistication. Thaw, consumed by his obsession with Stanford White, spends hours writing letters to Anthony Comstock, the notorious moral crusader who led the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, and imagining himself a defender of American womanhood against predatory libertines like White. The crusade, framed in religious and moral terms, channels Thaw's psychological instability into what he regards as righteous purpose. Comstock, leading anti-vice campaigns since the 1870s, welcomed allies in his effort to police sexuality and punish what he deemed moral corruption. Thaw's letters, never fully published but referenced in legal proceedings and biographical accounts, apparently detailed White's seduction of young women, presented Evelyn's case as an exemplar of wider predation, and urged legal or extra-legal action against White, Whether Comstock encouraged or merely tolerated Thaw's fixation remains unclear, but the correspondence shows Thaw constructing a narrative framework that would later support his defense that killing White was a righteous act, defense of virtue, justified revenge. The months in New York intensify Thaw's surveillance of White and his increasingly paranoid monitoring of Evelyn. He attends events where White is expected, follows his movements, collects information about his current life and relationships. He interrogates Evelyn repeatedly about her past relationship with White, forcing her to recount details, alternating between expressions of sympathy for her victimization and accusations that she enjoyed or encouraged White's attention. The interrogations, psychological torture, masquerading as concern, trap Evelyn in impossible position. Denying past involvement makes her a liar. Admitting it confirms Thaw's obsessive narrative. On the evening of 25th of June 1906, after drinking heavily at Sherry's restaurant on 44th Street, where gilt mirrors reflected gaslight and wealthy diners consumed elaborate meals in Baroque settings, Harry and Evelyn attended the rooftop performance at Madison Square Garden. The evening, recorded in detail through multiple eyewitness accounts compiled during the A investigation and trials, begins as a typical night out: dinner, drinks, theater, the routine entertainments of wealthy New York. The Madison Square Garden rooftop theater, designed by Stanford White, represented Gilded Age architecture at its most ambitious. An outdoor theater atop the massive square building, opened night air but equipped with electric lighting, orchestra, and stage machinery. The space, seating hundreds, offered summer entertainment combining theatrical performance with fashionable social gathering. Attending rooftop shows was seeing and being seen. Performance on stage inseparable from performance in the audience where social hierarchies displayed themselves. The show, Mam'selle Champagne, a light musical revue, had reached its finale number, I Could Love a Million Girls, when eyewitnesses later testify that Thaw rose from his table, walked with apparent purpose toward the area where Stanford White sat dining with friends, produced a pistol, and fired 3 shots into the architect's face at close range. The sequence happens quickly: Thaw crossing the space, the pistol appearing, shots fired, White collapsing, the orchestra falling silent, performers on stage frozen, the audience initially uncertain whether gunfire is part of the show or reality intruding on entertainment. The confusion, lasting seconds, speaks to how thoroughly spectacle defined this world. Violence itself seemed possibly theatrical, actual death mistaken for stage drama. The boundary between performance and reality so eroded that murder seemed like it might be entertainment. Only when White did not rise, when blood pooled on the rooftop floor, when Thaw held the pistol still smoking, did witnesses understand this was no performance. Newspapers like the New York Times run banner headlines the next morning: Thaw murders Stanford White, the stark language capturing the shock that a respectable heir would commit public murder. The coverage, beginning within hours and continuing for months, treats the killing as sensational entertainment, detailed descriptions of the murder scene, biographical sketches of all involved parties, speculation about motives and relationships, moral commentary on decadent wealth and sexual corruption. Artists' sketches, published before photography could capture courtroom scenes, show Evelyn being led away, hat askew, stunned, the careful grooming that always characterized her public appearance disrupted by shock and violence. In that instant, the network of power that had shaped her life is violently rearranged. An architect who curated pleasure palaces lies dead on the rooftop he designed. A millionaire bent on justice stands with the gun that has destroyed his own future as well as White's life. And a model whose image sold fantasies now stands at the center of a tableau of blood and electric light that newspapers will reproduce in drawings and descriptions for months. The immediate aftermath is chaos. Police arriving, crowd, panicking and trying to evacuate, witnesses shouting conflicting accounts. Evelyn herself too shocked for coherent response. Thaw is arrested immediately, making no resistance, apparently satisfied to have accomplished his purpose. Evelyn, suddenly a widow to a murderer, finds herself instantly transformed from protected wife to criminal's spouse, her status collapsing from mistress of millions to woman whose husband has committed the most public murder New York has witnessed in years. The physical sensations of that moment, the gunshots echoing in the open air space, the screams of witnesses, the smell of gunpowder mixing with summer heat and perfume, the texture of blood on the rooftop floor, become evidence, recorded in witness statements, analyzed by lawyers, reproduced in journalistic accounts. The scene, preserved through multiple testimonies, becomes one of the most documented moments of early 20th century life. Hundreds witnessed the murder. Dozens testified about what they saw. Newspapers recreated it through words and images, making it simultaneously private trauma and public spectacle. The woman who had been passed between rich men's fantasies is now the only person the public demands to hear from. What did she know? What had she told Thaw about White? Was she complicit in the murder? Did she encourage Thaw's obsession? The questions, immediate and insistent, transform Evelyn from person into evidence. Her life story now material for legal defense, moral judgment, and public entertainment. Every detail of her past, the modeling, the chorus line, the relationship with White, the European journey with Thaw, the marriage, will be excavated, analyzed, and interpreted through the lens of this moment when violence erupted from the long-simmering tensions her beauty had apparently caused. The hat carefully adjusted before attending the theater, chosen to complement her gown and signal her status as respectable married woman, now sits askew as police lead her away. The disorder visible in newspaper sketches marking the moment when performance becomes impossible, when the surface cracks and the violence beneath becomes undeniable. She will have to adjust that hat again, many times in the months and years ahead. But the gesture will never again signify what it once did: control, preparation, the construction of appearance that manages how others see her. After this night, the world sees her through the lens of murder, and no hat can shield against that gaze. On 23 January 1907, in the criminal branch of the Supreme Court in New York, jury selection began for Harry Thaw's trial. The courtroom, a temple of law with high ceilings and dark wood paneling, becomes the stage for what the press immediately calls the trial of the century. Though the century is barely 7 years old, the trial will last until April 12th, end in a hung jury unable to reach unanimous verdict, and be followed by a second trial beginning January 1908 that will find Thaw not guilty by reason of insanity, sentencing him to Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane rather than prison. The press coverage is unprecedented in scale and intensity. Every major newspaper assigns multiple reporters to cover the trial. Sketch artists produce daily drawings since photography is not permitted in the courtroom. Special correspondents are hired to provide psychological analysis, moral commentary, and fashion reporting. The New York Times, New York Herald, Pittsburgh papers, and dozens of others run front-page trial coverage daily, often devoting multiple pages to testimony transcripts, legal analysis, and human interest stories about the participants. The trial transcends mere criminal proceeding to become national entertainment and moral referendum on gilded age excess. It combines elements guaranteed to fascinate: sex, violence, extreme wealth, famous architect, beautiful woman, spectacular murder. The public, starved for such spectacle before radio or film provided regular access to dramatic narratives, devours every detail. Newspaper circulation soars. Special editions sell out. Crowds gather outside the courthouse hoping to glimpse the participants. Sketch artists and photographers positioned outside the courthouse and in hallways adjacent to the courtroom focus relentlessly on Evelyn Nesbit Thaw, whose beauty, one Pittsburgh paper declares, spelled death and ruin. Phrasing that blames her appearance for male violence makes her responsible for what men do in response to seeing her. The language exemplifies how media coverage consistently frames Evelyn as cause rather than witness or victim, her beauty treated as weapon or curse, her presence sufficient explanation for murder. Each day she walks past reporters into the courtroom, straightening the brim of her hat like armor, the gesture now performed under intense scrutiny with hundreds watching her every movement, judging her composure, interpreting her appearance as evidence of character. Fashion reporters note what she wears each day, describe her hats in detail, analyze her color choices for hidden meaning. Moral commentators praise her modesty or criticize her vanity depending on political alignment. The attention, inescapable and exhausting, turns every aspect of her presentation into public text requiring interpretation. On the witness stand, she recounts the mirror room, the assault, the years of manipulation, a story recorded verbatim in stenographic transcripts now archived and digitized, preserved in multiple legal history collections. Her testimony, extending across several days, provides detailed narrative of her relationship with White. The first meeting, the arrangement of dinners and gifts, the night in the mirror room that she describes as rape, the continuation of the relationship under circumstances of economic pressure and psychological manipulation. The testimony serves Thaw's defense strategy of unwritten law, the notion, recognized in some jurisdictions and cultural contexts, that a husband may justifiably kill a man who has ruined his wife. The doctrine, never formally enacted as law but operating as customary understanding, held that men possessed honor requiring defense, that women constituted property whose violation demanded violent response, that certain insults or injuries warranted extra-legal revenge. The strategy required presenting White as villain, Evelyn as innocent victim corrupted, and Thaw as righteous avenger whose violence, though technically illegal, was morally justified. Evelyn's testimony must therefore walk an impossible line, describing White's predation in detail sufficient to justify Thaw's outrage, while also presenting herself as innocent enough that her corruption warrants revenge. Too much agency in the relationship with White would suggest she consented, making Thaw's murder less defensible. Too little would make her seem pathetic rather than worthy of protection. The performance, scripted by defense attorneys and rehearsed extensively, requires her to display suffering without losing dignity, admit sexual experience without appearing promiscuous, acknowledge continued relationship with White without seeming willing. The jury is sequestered for the first time in American legal history. Jurors housed in a hotel under guard to prevent outside contact or media influence. The sequestration, unprecedented, acknowledges the case's extraordinary public profile and the concern that jurors might be swayed by newspaper coverage rather than courtroom evidence. Church groups attempt to censor coverage, arguing that detailed testimony about sexual assault corrupts public morals. Newspapers resist, claiming public interest justifies complete reporting. The tension between Victorian morality and modern media spectacle plays out through the trial's duration. Her testimony turns private trauma into public spectacle. The mirror room, described in forensic detail with architecture, furniture, clothing all documented, becomes a national obsession. Refined language, the poise, the controlled voice, the neat tailoring, is both her shield and the medium through which suffering must be made legible to the jury, press, and public. She cannot simply state facts. She must perform victimhood in ways that satisfy multiple audiences with incompatible demands. Legally convincing, morally acceptable, emotionally authentic but not unseemly, detailed but not titillating, experienced but still innocent. Defense attorneys coach her in testimony technique, maintaining eye contact with the jury, speaking clearly but not loudly, showing emotion but not breaking down, dressing modestly but well. The preparation, documented in legal scholars' accounts of the trial, reveals how completely her presentation is managed, how every element is calculated for effect, how even her apparently spontaneous responses are actually carefully rehearsed. Performances, yet the coaching is necessary. Unscripted testimony might fail to communicate what legal strategy requires, might reveal complexity that simplified narrative cannot accommodate. Cross-examination by prosecution is brutal. Attorneys attempt to establish that she consented to White's attention, benefited from his financial support, and continued the relationship voluntarily. They question why she did not report the assault to authorities, why she accepted gifts afterward, why she maintained contact for years if she considered herself victimized. The questions, framed to suggest that her behavior proves consent, ignore how power imbalances constrain choice, how economic desperation limits options, how young women in 1902 had minimal legal recourse against wealthy men, how reporting would have meant publicity and ruin regardless of legal outcome. When the verdict sends Thaw to an asylum rather than prison or electric chair, it leaves Evelyn acquitted of nothing in the court of public opinion. She is blamed for White's death despite not pulling the trigger, blamed for Thaw's violence despite being his victim, as well as his accomplice, blamed for her own suffering because her beauty and theatrical background make her suspicious, blamed for everything while receiving credit for nothing. The trial, meant to judge Thaw's guilt or innocence, has actually judged her, found her simultaneously too innocent to have resisted White and too experienced to deserve protection, too beautiful to be blameless, and too fallen to merit sympathy. The legal outcome, Thaw institutionalized but alive, not executed, means Evelyn remains married to a man now imprisoned in an asylum, unable to divorce without losing access to Thaw family money, unable to remarry while Thaw lives, unable to work in theater because notoriety makes her unemployable, unable to escape the identity, the girl in the red velvet swing, that media has constructed around her. The trial that was supposed to clarify the truth has instead created a legend that obscures her actual life beneath layers of interpretation, speculation, and moralizing. By 1913, with Thaw confined to Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane and legal battles ongoing over his sanity and potential release, Evelyn is back on stage, now in vaudeville rather than legitimate theater. The shift downward in theatrical hierarchy reflects her situation. No respectable theater will hire her for serious roles, but vaudeville, less concerned with moral propriety, will showcase her notoriety. Reviews of her act in New York and Chicago note less her dancing or singing ability than the aura of scandal that draws crowds. She has become an attraction, famous for being famous, notorious for circumstances rather than talent, performing herself as much as any choreographed routine. The act, documented in theater programs and reviews, involves her appearing in costumes that reference her past. Beautiful gowns, elaborate hats, the visual signatures of her modeling and Floridora days. She performs songs, sometimes monologues about her life, material that walks the line between autobiography and entertainment. Audiences attend to see the woman from the trial, to compare the person to the newspaper sketches, to consume scandal in person, rather than through print. The experience is voyeuristic, turning her trauma into a spectacle that she must repeatedly perform to earn the income that Thaw's institutionalization has cut off. In 1914, she published The Story of My Life, the first of two memoirs, written with or by ghostwriter, blending personal recollection with excerpts from letters and court testimony, giving historians a layered record of how she understood her own life and the roles she was obliged to play. The book, commercially successful, provides income and allows her some control over narrative, though reviews often focus more on sensational content than her perspective. She writes or approves text that presents her as a victim of circumstances, innocent, corrupted by powerful men attempting to reclaim moral standing through public confession and appeal for sympathy. 20 years later, in 1934, she published Prodigal Days, revisiting the same events with the distance of age and different social context. The second memoir, written in first person and showing signs of her own voice more than ghostwriter intervention, reflects on her life with more bitterness, fewer attempts at justification, greater willingness to name the systems that exploited her. The title references the biblical parable, positioning her as one who strayed and now returns, though the text itself is more complex, acknowledging that she never quite left nor fully returned, that she occupies liminal space between respectability and scandal, between innocence claimed and experience undeniable. Divorced from Thaw in 1915, after years of legal maneuvering, she regained freedom to remarry, but little else. The divorce, granted on grounds of insanity and cruelty, severs her from Thaw family money, leaving her again financially precarious. She later marries Jack Clifford, a dancer and sometime partner in vaudeville acts, a relationship documented as troubled and eventually failing. She tours in cabaret, performs in increasingly lower tier venues, her star power diminishing as public memory of the trial fades and younger performers displace her. Between 1917 and 1920, she appeared in silent films, often cast as vamp or tragic beauty, roles that capitalize on her notorious image. Film titles like Threads of Destiny, The Woman Who Gave, and I Want to Forget reference her past indirectly, marketing films to audiences who know her story and expect it to be enacted fictionally. Her screen presence, documented in surviving stills and fragments, shows someone learned in presenting herself to cameras, comfortable with visual performance, but limited by the roles available to women of her background and reputation. In nightclub publicity shots from the 1920s, preserved in various theatrical archives, she still adjusts a hat or headpiece before going on, a smaller, less ostentatious silhouette than the Florodora days, reflecting both changing fashion and her reduced circumstances, but the same gesture of preparation. The photographs, now faded, show someone aging in the public eye, beauty that was her fortune now diminishing, the approach of middle age threatening the only currency she has ever possessed. The work of surviving through performance continues through the decades. She teaches dance, runs a small tea room in Atlantic City, gives interviews to journalists revisiting the trial on anniversaries. Each interview requires her to perform the story again, answer the same questions, reenact trauma for new generations of readers who consume it as history or entertainment. Grace has become labor, the daily work of turning notoriety into rent, of narrating her own story before others do, of maintaining composure while discussing events that broke something permanent inside her. The 1930s and 1940s bring increasing obscurity. Vaudeville dies as cinema and radio replace live performance. Nightclubs hire younger women. The trial, though it remains crime of the century in historical accounts, fades from immediate public memory as new scandals replace old ones. Evelyn becomes a footnote, curiosity, the answer to trivia questions about Gilded Age excess and White's architectural legacy. She survives through a combination of small earnings, possible assistance from friends or former admirers, and the accumulated capital of decades of careful living. Each time she steps into the light, whether theater spotlight, photographer's flash, or journalist's attention, she must decide how much of the old script to perform and how much to quietly rewrite. The decision, never simple, balances authenticity against marketability, truth against survival, acknowledging damage against maintaining dignity. She cannot completely reject the narrative others have constructed because it is the source of her only remaining value in the public market. She cannot fully embrace it because doing so means accepting responsibility for violence done to her, treating her own victimization as her fault, or at least her inevitable destiny. The memoirs, the vaudeville acts, the interviews all represent attempts to control narrative while acknowledging that complete control is impossible. She can offer her version of events, but readers and audiences will interpret through their own lenses, bringing assumptions about women, sexuality, class, and morality that no testimony can fully counter. The truth of her experience remains trapped inside frameworks others have built, visible only through distorting lenses that make certainty about her actual life, her actual feelings, her actual choices almost impossible to achieve. The photographs from these decades, preserved in collections documenting early 20th century entertainment, show the progression from teenage model to Florodora girl to trial defendant to aging performer. The images, arranged chronologically, tell a story of beauty's appreciation and depreciation in cultures that value women primarily for appearance, that discard them when youth fades, that offer no retirement from the performance except obscurity and poverty. Her face, so valuable at 20, loses market worth at 40. At 50 becomes mainly historical curiosity. The former beauty who spelled death and ruin, now weathered and tired and trying to survive. Yet the photographs also show resilience, someone who continued performing despite having every reason to quit, who maintained dignity despite relentless judgment, who attempted to construct meaning from experiences that might have broken someone with less survival skill or perhaps less stubbornness. The adjustment of the hat, visible in photographs spanning decades, remains constant. The moment of preparation, the checking of presentation, the brief assertion of self management before surrendering to others' gazes. The gesture, an unconscious habit that became a trademark, represents continuity across tumult, the persistence of self despite everything that has tried to erase or reshape her. By the 1950s, Evelyn lived quietly in California, far from the Natrona of her childhood and the New York of her fame and scandal. California, the destination for so many seeking reinvention or escape, offers anonymity in its sprawl and sunshine, distance from the eastern cities where her name still carries meaning to those old enough to remember. She works intermittently as an artist. Her earlier experience as model's passive subject now transformed into active creation, painting, and sculpture that provide modest income and creative outlet. She teaches ceramics at a studio, instructing others in techniques she learned later in life, finding satisfaction in craft's quiet discipline after decades of spectacle and judgment. She also works as caregiver, tending to others in domestic settings, labor that is poorly paid and largely invisible, but that provides steady work for aging women with limited credentials or savings. The descent from mistress of millions to paid caregiver measures the distance traveled, the complete reversal of fortune that no amount of beauty or fame could prevent. Yet the work also offers something the theatrical career never did: privacy, relationships not based on her appearance, value derived from what she does rather than how she looks. Her past resurfaces occasionally in nostalgic magazine pieces about the girl on the velvet swing, the phrase that had attached to her during the trial becoming shorthand for an entire era. The articles appearing in publications like Collier's, American Weekly, and various Sunday supplements revisit the White murder, reprint famous photographs, and interview aging journalists who covered the trial. Sometimes they track Evelyn down for comment. Sometimes they simply appropriate her image and story without permission or compensation. The lack of control over her own narrative, constant throughout her life, persists into old age. The pieces typically adopt one of two tones: sensationalism that treats her life as cautionary tale about ambition and sexuality, or sentimentality that romanticizes Gilded Age excess while ignoring its violence and exploitation. Neither approach captures the complexity of actual experience, both reducing her to a symbol of fallen woman, of innocent victim, of dangerous beauty, of bygone era. She exists in public imagination as a figure rather than a person, the actual woman invisible beneath layers of interpretation accumulated across decades. Neighbors in California, interviewed years later or quoted in obituaries, describe her as private, someone who kept to herself, occasionally mentioned her past but did not dwell on it, seemed to want mainly to be left alone. The comments suggest someone who had survived by learning to separate public identity from private self, who maintained boundaries that protected interior life from external scrutiny, who had finally achieved the privacy that early fame made impossible. The physical environment of California, the light, the space, the relative classlessness of a newer region, perhaps offered relief from eastern cities where social hierarchies remained rigid and her history was better known. In California, she could be an older woman living modest life rather than eternally Evelyn Nesbit from the trial, could work and socialize without constant weight of past, could exist in present rather than being perpetually defined by events decades earlier. On 17 January 1967, she died in a nursing home in Santa Monica, aged 81 or 82, the uncertainty about her birth year persisting to the end. The nursing home, a common fate for elderly Americans without family support or sufficient savings, represents the final destination of someone who had once been among the most photographed women in America. The contrast between youthful fame and aged obscurity, while dramatic, was not unusual. Many who achieved early celebrity experienced similar trajectories, fame offering little protection against the vulnerabilities of aging and poverty. Obituaries describe her as former artist, model, and actress whose life was linked to the crime of the century, the phrasing reducing 8 decades to a few roles and one event. The New York Times, which had covered her so extensively 60 years earlier, runs a modest obituary that recaps the murder, trial, and her subsequent career. Some papers reprint the famous Serenity photograph from 1901, the teenage model looking eternally young, while the news of her death makes clear that time had done its work despite the image's immortality. Archives now hold Otto Serenity photographs, courtroom sketches, and clippings of headlines that once shouted her name, materials preserved in institutions including the Library of Congress, various university special collections, and legal history archives. Researchers studying Gilded Age society, early 20th century celebrity, feminist history, legal history, or architectural history all potentially encounter her as evidence of beauty standards, sexual exploitation, media spectacle, legal defenses, or simply as a famous subject of a famous architect killed in a famous crime. The archival materials, carefully preserved and cataloged, ensure that her image and story survive even as personal memory fades. The photographs, especially, guarantee a kind of immortality. Digitized and reproduced, they circulate online and in publications, making her face available to audiences unimaginable in 1901 when Cerrone first photographed her. The survival, though, is partial and distorted. The images persist, but the person they depicted is gone, leaving only the surface, the pose, the performance captured by cameras that could record appearance but not experience, beauty but not consciousness, the visible but not the felt. Somewhere in a reading room, a researcher turns over a glossy print from 1902. Evelyn in profile, hat brim casting a soft shadow over her eyes, the photograph cropped to emphasize the face, eliminating context, making her pure image divorced from any specific time or place. The caption is simple: Evelyn Nesbit, C1 1902, with no mention of Madison Square Garden, Thaw, or White, nothing to explain who she was beyond the name and approximate date. The stripped caption, whether intentional or simply the result of archival processing, represents a final form of erasure, the reduction of a life to a beautiful face, the elimination of story, the transformation of person into aesthetic object. The gesture we have watched across decades, a young woman adjusting her hat before the gaze of others, survives now only as a frozen curve of brim and shadow, a moment captured but forever incomplete, showing the preparation but not the performance, the exterior but not the interior, the image but not the person, the body beneath the hat, the hands that adjusted it, the consciousness that inhabited the body and directed the hands, all are gone, leaving only the photograph that was always incomplete representation, always surface without depth, always evidence of visibility but never proof of understanding. In the end, the scandal ages into a footnote, but the photograph remains young forever. The images circulate, reproduced in books and online, beautiful and mute, unable to correct misunderstandings or complicate simplified narratives. The photographs survive the person, outlast the memory, persist as evidence of something: beauty, era, celebrity, exploitation. But what they prove remains ambiguous, subject to interpretation, meaning different things to different viewers in different times. The girl adjusting her hat, caught in that eternal moment of preparation, never steps forward into the performance the viewer imagines, never speaks to correct the stories told about her, never ages beyond the moment the shutter captured. She remains forever young, forever beautiful, forever silent, forever available for others' interpretations, forever trapped in the instant before the future that has already happened descends upon her. Today, in the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division, in a climate-controlled vault where temperature and humidity are precisely maintained to preserve fragile materials, an archivist carefully returns a 1901 Otto Cerrone portrait of Evelyn Nesbit to its archival folder. The emulsion is slightly cracked at the edges, lines spreading from corners like age lines that Evelyn herself developed but that the photograph will never show. The hat's feathers blur into the dark backdrop, details lost to time and reproduction, but the face remains astonishingly clear, the features precise and sharp, the expression enigmatic or vulnerable or confident depending on how the viewer chooses to read it. The photograph, one of many in the collection, has been digitized, making it available to researchers worldwide who will never touch the fragile original, but can view it instantly on screens, the image traveling further and faster than Cerrone could have imagined when he first captured it. The digital reproduction, while more accessible, is also more detached, stripped of physical presence, existing purely as data, able to be cropped and manipulated and reproduced infinitely without degradation or limit. On a nearby microfilm reader, another researcher scrolls through newspaper archives. The headline Thaw murders Stanford White, flickering past in a negative image, white text on black background, the inversion making the words seem to float. The newspaper, preserved on film to save space and prevent further deterioration of crumbling paper, has been digitized as well. OCR technology making the text searchable, allowing researchers to find specific phrases across decades of daily publications. In another reel, advanced, a transcript page records her answering, voice translated into text, personality flattened into punctuation and capitalization. On April 4, 1905, in Pittsburgh, the same features that sold stockings, chocolates, and theater tickets in life sold newspapers, moral crusades, and legal arguments in scandal and trial. Her face, reproduced millions of times across multiple media in decades, became currency more valuable than any wages she earned, though she never controlled the value or captured more than a tiny fraction of what her image generated for photographers, publishers, newspapers, and the many others who profited from reproducing her appearance. The rooftop garden where Stanford White was murdered is gone, demolished when the original Madison Square Garden was torn down in 1925 to make room for the New York Life Insurance Company building. Madison Square Garden itself has been rebuilt elsewhere, first at 8th Avenue and 49th Street, later at its current location above Penn Station. The spaces where her life unfolded, the West 22nd Street rooms, White's 24th Street apartment, the Casino Theater, the Wellington Hotel, have been destroyed or repurposed, the physical geography erased by New York's constant rebuilding. But the portrait remains, a single still frame that carried her into the imagination of a world and then refused to age alongside the woman who outlived it by decades. The photographs, especially the Cerrone portraits, have achieved iconic status, reproduced in books about Gilded Age, early photography, architectural history, legal history, feminist history. They appear without permission and without payment, the copyright long expired, the image now public domain, available for anyone to use for any purpose. The hat is tilted just as it was on that summer night in 1906. The angle that she had learned through years of practice made photographers and artists happy. The slight tilt that elongated the neck and created shadow that defined features. What has changed is not the image but how we read what it was trying to hold in place. No longer seeing innocent beauty but constructed performance. No longer viewing natural grace but learned skill. No longer finding simple prettiness but complex negotiation between visibility and vulnerability, between the need to be seen and the danger that seeing brought. Contemporary viewers, looking at the Cerrone photograph, might see exploitation where earlier viewers saw celebration, might recognize grooming where they saw romance, might understand economic necessity where they imagined freely chosen glamour. The image hasn't changed, but the frameworks for interpretation have shifted, allowing readings that were difficult or impossible when the photograph first circulated. Yet the shift in interpretation, while important, doesn't restore to Evelyn any agency over meaning. Her image remains subject to others' readings, useful for illustrating points she might not have agreed with, evidence for arguments she had no chance to make. The persistence of the photographs ensures a kind of immortality, but one she did not choose and could not control, one that fixes her forever at the moment of greatest vulnerability, while claiming to honor or preserve or document. The images show her beauty, but not her consciousness, her appearance, but not her experience, what others saw, but not what she felt, the performance, but not the cost of performing. They make her available to viewers across time, but only partially, only superficially, only in ways that confirm rather than challenge the dynamics that made her famous. The transformation of women into images, the circulation of those images as commodities, the erasure of person beneath the picture. In the archive, scholars piece together her life from fragments, the photographs, the newspaper accounts, the trial transcripts, the memoirs, the scattered letters and documents that survive. Each fragment offers evidence but incomplete and biased, filtered through technologies and institutions and perspectives that shaped what could be recorded and preserved. The biography that emerges, no matter how carefully researched, remains partial, subject to revision as new materials surface or interpretive frameworks shift. Yet even incomplete, the archive testifies to a life lived at the intersection of beauty, fame, exploitation, and violence, a life that illuminates larger patterns in how women's bodies became commodities in modern visual culture, how fame created new forms of vulnerability, how legal systems failed to protect those most exposed to powerful men's predation. Her story, individual and unique, was also representative, one instance of dynamics that shaped countless lives, but that usually left fewer traces. The hat, adjusted so many times across so many years, visible in scores of photographs, serving as preparation, armor, and trademark, remains tilted in the images but can never be adjusted again. The gesture is frozen, preserved, made permanent by technology that captures the surface while letting everything else slip away. What the gesture meant to her, the moment of checking, preparing, asserting some small control before surrendering to others' gazes, can only be inferred, imagined, projected onto the evidence that shows the exterior but cannot access the interior. The gloves that Florence Maybrick pulled tight before entering Liverpool court, the letters she wrote that became evidence, exist as parallel to Evelyn's hat, letters, and photographs, gestures of grace and preparation transformed into evidence, performances of femininity used against the performers, beauty and refinement turned from assets to liabilities when power structures demanded victims. The specifics differed: poison versus pistols, British versus American courts, earlier versus later Gilded Age, but the underlying dynamics of women's vulnerability to violence and judgment remain constant across the cases. The archive preserves what survives, but cannot restore what was lost: the lived experience, the consciousness, the agency that photographs could never capture and institutions never recognized. The images remain beautiful and mute, young forever while the person aged and died, evidence of visibility but not of understanding, proof of fame but not of justice, testament to beauty but also to everything beauty cost her.